Good morning, everybody. Or, like I always say, afternoon, evening, whenever it is that you are watching this little lecture. This is going to be the part of, or the start of chapter 14. As I posted on the website, chapter 14 is chock full of information that any fire administrator, any public safety administrator needs to know about. Probably the biggest is the Fair Labor Standards Act that governs hourly hours, maximum hours, overtime, and all of that kind of thing. And because of public safety schedules, this is something that is ingrained in the public safety arena with the different shifts, different hours, and different calculations. So I'm going to talk about a few things having to do with the FLSA. In your assignments, I have divvied up the rest of it, and I think I asked David Kimbrell to talk about FLSA as far as the exemptions, administrative exemptions. There's something called a firefighter's exemption. There's other type EMS exemption. So I'm going to let him talk about those. I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of FLSA and what it means to you. As if you don't, you might already know that, because I know that pay calculations are something that firefighters seem to have down. And this is my long check, my short check, that sort of thing. I heard that for the longest time, and I had no idea what they were talking about, because I was like, all my checks are the same. But anyway, and of course I'm going to consult with my notes here and the book as well. The Fair Labor Standards Act actually was passed by Congress in 1938, so it's not new. However, I'm sorry, I keep pulling on this. However, it did not apply to public safety or until the public sector, let me say that, until 1974. So it was around for a long time for private business, but it didn't apply to the public sector until 1974. And even then, it was challenged, and the Supreme Court dismissed that, said that the Department of Labor does not have the ability to, or that Congress lacked the ability to regulate employment relationships between states and their employees. So basically, they said that Congress couldn't apply it to the states. But then, in a landmark decision and in an unusual situation, about 10 years later, I believe, in 1986, the Supreme Court reversed itself and said that, yes, FLSA does apply to public safety or public sector employees, all public sector. It just gets a little dicey when we're talking about public safety. Of course, Fair Labor Standards Act was meant to establish fairness, I guess. It did away with child labor laws. They could not. It has to do with minimum wage and maximum hours worked and all that sort of thing to protect the employee. And the enforcement of the FLSA is the responsibility of the Department of Labor. So under FLSA, when we look at who is an employee, well, it's anybody that's employed. And that's the way it reads. It is full-time, part-time, temporary, all of those people apply. A case that's or a phrase that's used to define who an employee is suffered or permitted to work. So I guess that's even if you don't want to, you are working or you are permitted to work. So I guess it depends on the glass half full, half empty theory. Of course, volunteers are volunteers. They're not covered under FLSA. They are considered to be volunteers, even if, I'm reading here, if they receive no compensation, okay? Where it gets dicey is where an employee wants to volunteer for their own department. That's where the whole problem came in. We used to want to use personnel, or we had personnel that wanted to do public education type of activities off duty. And they were not allowed to do that. And so it protects the employer and the employee in a lot of ways. But the bottom line is that FLSA says that if the employer allows the firefighter to volunteer, the firefighter is entitled to compensation for all hours worked, including overtime compensation. So, even if somebody wants to volunteer, they could come back later and say, I want to get paid. And the employer would need to pay them for that. So it's a lot of, I know a lot of departments use off-duty personnel to do public education activities, but they are paid. And it's considered a part-time job over and above their hourly, their hours at the fire department. So you can volunteer with another department, that's fine. But you can't volunteer with your employer for anything, which is kind of weird, but it is what it is. When we talk about maximum hours, FLSA, of course, says that an employee must receive compensation at the rate of 1.5 times their hourly rate for hours over 40 hours a week. So this is where it gets complicated for the fire service. Sundays, holidays, weekends are not, you don't have to pay overtime for those under FLSA. It is mainly focused on the maximum hours per week. So it doesn't matter if you're Monday through Friday, Tuesday through Saturday, that magic number is 40 hours for the normal employee and the normal work. So this impacts the fire service in an unprecedented manner. That because we all know that how, and I'm sure that we could talk to each one of you and your pay is calculated in different ways. Those of you that work on shift, there's 168 hours in a week. And so fire departments, career departments provide coverage 24/7. So they cover those 168 hours. Some do it with 2 shifts, some do it with 3 shifts, some do it with 4 shifts. But however it is calculated, if you're working different shifts, like the 3 shifts, 56 hours a week is the average. If there's 4 shifts, it's 42 hours a week. The problem comes in, and you can work around that a little bit, but it's the fluctuating hours from week to week. One week you're going to work, say your work week starts from Sunday and runs to Saturday. You might work Sunday, and then you're going to work Wednesday. Is that right? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So you got 3 days in. But then you might work Monday and Thursday, and you don't have 3 days. So that's where that short long thing came in. A lot of departments now just have a standardized format for doing that, for paying people, whether it's straight pay. Most of the time, the short check included, and then there was this whole in a 3-month period, you're going to work more, an extra 24-hour shift. That was where Kelly days were introduced to alleviate that overtime issue. And if any of your departments do Kelly days, they were a good thing. When I was with LaGrange Fire Department, they introduced Kelly days during economic hard times, and everybody raised Cain. And then after about a year, I said, "Can we get another Kelly day?" Kind of liked that concept. So that helped to alleviate some of the overtime issue as well for jurisdictions that might be paying that. So when we talk about who is entitled to overtime, all employees over 40 hours, with the exception of police, fire, and certain other types of positions. And that's where that executive and administrative exemption comes in. So I am going to, when we're talking about that firefighter exemption, it has to do with overtime. I'm going to let David tell us about that. And he's also going to talk to us a little bit about emergency medical exception, and then the executive and administrative professional exemption. So there are some exemptions to that 40-hour rule. It in different places it's worked in different ways, and I'm not sure it was legal or not. No one ever challenged it. It's like they dock your pay if you work under 40, but if you work over 40, you don't get compensated. So again, different places have come to different arrangements and different groupings to that sort of thing. So what hours are included, and this is where, the normal 40-hour week employee does not get paid to sleep. They don't get paid to eat. They get 2 official breaks during the day, and they get their hour for lunch. But again, that's different for public safety personnel. Waiting time, the time you're hanging out at the station, supposedly waiting for a call, when people think you're not doing anything, but we all know that you are. That is compensable. You're paid for that. Even if you're reading a book, watching TV, as long as you are engaged by the employer to wait, then you're getting paid. Sleep time, most people don't get paid to sleep, but it has to do with whether you're still working or not, whether that sleep time is your own. We all know that in the fire department that your sleep is interrupted, and so you are paid for that. It's still considered waiting time. So if you're sleeping, you're waiting. There's no breaks required under FLSA for anyone, it says. Short breaks lasting 5 to 20 minutes are provided. If that is the case, a short break time is considered to be compensable. So you get your 15-minute break. Some employers require that you take that. It is compensable. You're getting paid for that. Meal times, again, you're getting paid for that because you're not free to leave. As a 40-hour employee, I'm free to leave for that hour. I don't have to do anything at work. I don't have to respond, report, I'm not working. And so I can leave. It's a little bit different. Training time, again, that is considered to be compensable. That gets a little complicated too. It is considered to be compensable. It may be excluded if 4 criteria are met. It's outside normal hours, it's voluntary, it's not job related, and no other work is concurrently performed. So if you go to the fire academy, I guess, if you wanted to challenge this, some departments don't pay you to go there. You're on your own time when you go there, but according to this, it may be outside of normal hours, but it certainly is job related for the most part, unless it is a requirement that you go. So that may be, when it says, is it voluntary? It may not be voluntary on your part. You may be required to go in. And in that case, they're supposed to compensate you for that. Travel time to and from work is not compensable. Don't get paid for that. But there is kind of this gray area about what is, if you're traveling to, let's say that you were part of a task force team that deployed to Matthew. So you got an extended travel time. Is that compensable? If it is part of your job, it's considered to be work time. Or it will even have a shorter example. You have to go between station and station. You are, if you're, I don't know, if you're a chief officer that falls under FLSA, which is another question to deal with, and you drive from station to station, that time, that's a part of your job, and so you are paid for that. Where I was talking about with Matthew, at the end of the work shift, if an employee is unable to go home due to the distance to the workplace, what happens then? And this is where I was talking about, if you're deployed because of Matthew, or you're on, wildland fires or something like that. It depends on if, let's say, at the end of your shift, if that time is yours, if you're able to reasonably engage in personal activities. If you were deployed for Matthew, were you able to go out to eat and sit down and eat and not respond back? Were you able to do what you wanted to on that time? Then it's not compensable. But if you, under FLSA, if you had a tent and you were there and you had to, you're sleeping there, and you can't leave and go anywhere, you might have to relieve somebody. That's where it gets a little more complicated and a little more confusing. So it has to do with leaving the premises for purposes of your own. So lots of gray area, and a lot of times employers don't understand FLSA. There's a great example of this case in the book Renfro versus City of Emporia. And what these guys said was that they worked a shift, and then the next 24-hour shift, let's say A shift works. The next 24 hours, A shift is on callback. And as a part of that callback, they could be called back 3 to 5 times a day was the average, I think, with the most being like 13 or 15. They had to be there within 20 minutes. And they, if they didn't respond, if they didn't answer the call, then they got what they refer to as a white slip, meaning a disciplinary action. If you got so many white slips, then you were terminated. So they didn't leave a lot of leeway in there for firefighters. Some of them were trying to work part-time jobs, but they couldn't on their callback day because maybe it was farther away than 20 minutes. I don't know if there was a residency requirement, but if you live 30 minutes away, you might have to stay in town. And so the city said that this was not compensable time. This is where we start talking about on-call time. And so the court ultimately, and read the case because it does bring out some really great points about what constitutes compensable on-call time. That when an off-duty firefighter is required to be on call, and there's limitations placed on them that restrict their normal daily activities. They were saying they couldn't go out of town, they couldn't be unavailable. They always had to remain basically available during that time. So under ordinary circumstances, on-call time is not compensable as long as there's not a lot of restrictions placed on that time. Being available is not really a restriction as long as, there's no real restriction about the amount of time that you have to respond or, that sort of thing. And you're able to do other things. There's no restrictions placed on your freedom. You can't go. I'm thinking about my own situation when I was on-call investigator. You didn't exactly leave town and drive to North Carolina to the mountains. It was using your best judgment for that. But we could, I could go to the grocery store and I could take care of my activities of daily living to do that. So read the Renfro case in your book. FLSA doesn't care about swap time or substitutions, as the book refers to it. Firefighters can swap. They don't really care. That all of that's ignored when calculating hours. There's an exception in here about medical attention, and that's kind of an interesting thing in that if you are on the job injured, FLSA, now we're talking FLSA, does not care, you don't get paid for that time. So you are injured on the job, you go to the hospital, FLSA says you don't have to be paid. Workers' comp is governing at that point, and that's where they're going to pick up. People used to joke. I heard this joke a long time ago, and I thought it was pretty sad about, if someone falls off the roof before they hit the ground, you fire them. But under FLSA, that's kind of the theory, I guess. But workers' comp is a different story. No, and I don't know anyone that's ever not been paid when they were injured, but FLSA says you don't have to pay them. Thinking if you looked at that, then there would be a lot of people going to the hospital. So it was to protect the employer is why they did that. But again, workers' compensation and FLSA, those are two different entities, and so your workers' comp is gonna kick in. Some places have compensatory time, comp time as we call it, for public safety or public employees. They can accrue that. It does have to be paid, so to speak, at time and a half. And if you leave before if with comp time on the books, you are supposed to be paid for that. And not, let's say that you've had comp time on the books for 6 months and 3 months ago you got a raise, they have to pay you at your present rate. So it's a little bit, again, I think a lot of employers don't understand. A lot of employees don't understand, and they never take their employers to task. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. It kind of goes from one extreme to the other here, where we got people that want to volunteer for their employer, and then we got people that'll hang out at the hospital so they can get paid extra. But FLSA, when we talk about maximum hours worked, when overtime kicks in, I think that those are really the things to explore as a chief officer in a department, if that is if that's your role, and understanding how FLSA works, understanding how your pay is calculated, or not your pay specifically, but in your department, how that pay is allocated. How, I think about our police officers, and then they have this thing about court time. So what happens when they work there, they have their shift hours, but then they have to go to court, or they have training. They fall under the same requirements. They fall under the same rules and regulations. So I'll be interested to hear from David about how they describe the firefighters exemption. There's a nice chart on page 459 in your book. The EMS or emergency medical exception, and then the executive, administrative, and professional exemption. So just be aware that FLSA is a big factor in the fire service, or in public safety, in the public sector as a whole. Whereas when we talk about the public sector as a whole, most people work that standard 40-hour work week. When you talk about your public safety personnel, this is where it gets a little dicey as far as what is considered overtime, when they have to be paid, and how they have to be paid. So that's my part for this chapter. Be sure to read the book. Be sure and look at the slides as well to see if any information that I might have missed. I wanted to mention this too, that Kurt Verone, who's the author of this book, I have heard him speak on a couple of occasions. He's very outstanding. He's a firefighter, chief, as well as a lawyer. And I think he's retired now and he does his lawyering thing, but he is very well versed. He actually has a website called Fire Law. I think it's firelaw.com. And he also has a Twitter account that I think is Fire Law, or at Fire Law. And there's some interesting stuff that comes out on there. He usually posts a case a day that either is under consideration or being considered or has been decided about different legal aspects in the fire service, not just FLSA, but all different kinds of. He's really big right now in social media. He has some really great insight into the whole aspect of social media. And I know that we're going to be hearing from that about that a little bit later. But you may want to follow him. You may want to check out his website. Amazingly enough, I actually emailed him the other day about a question I had about a couple of cases in the book, and he emailed me back. So he's a pretty down to earth guy. So you may want to follow him. Check out his webpage, firelaw.com. And I look forward to hearing your reports. Thanks so much. Have a great day.